All right, so today we'll be covering cohabitation and marriage, and what that looks like for families in the US. So first we'll be talking about romantic relationships, which is my favorite thing to talk about. It's what I like to study. But specifically, we'll be talking about how people find intimate partners and form relationships. Next, we'll move to cohabitation, what it is and what it means for families and family formation. And then finally, we'll go over marriage, including marriage rates, the marriage market, and how marriages work today. Okay. So first we'll talk about forming a union or romantic relationships broadly. The term courtship, which was popular in the 1800s, refers to a dating practice that was a publicly visible process with rules and restrictions through which young men and women could find a partner to marry. If you've watched Bridgerton, then this is the type of union formation that is seen in the show. Essentially, a young couple can only be seen in public together, and usually there was an escort nearby to ensure that nothing improper was happening. So, no like touching, intimate kind of touching conversations, things like that were really happening. There's always someone nearby kind of watching to make sure everything was going smoothly. However, courtship slowly began to die off in the 1900s, especially in the US, with the rise of industrialism. As people moved to cities and gained more independence from their families of origin, it was harder for parents and other adults to keep an eye on young couples. This shift led to the union formation, commonly known as dating. This type of union formation became popular in the 1920s. In dating, usually the boy goes to the girl's house and asks her to go out, and then they spend the evening away from her parents' home. The dating we know today is a bit different, but the principle is still the same. Couples go out and they typically go out of sight from any authority figure. This type of system um, now favored men and allowed men more freedom to pick and choose who they would want to take out on a date because they had the financial power and the money to take specific people out. While before courtship, um, granted women more power to pick and choose who they were going to be seen in public with. It also allowed more couples freedom from their parents, and it also allowed them to choose who to date since they were no longer under an older adult supervision. Dating is still a pretty common practice, but the way we go about it has shifted over time. Today, most people are shifting towards online dating. In a national survey conducted in 2017, online dating was the most popular method for meeting people and was more popular than traditional methods of meeting partners like through family, friends, or work. I know for me, I used online dating. It's actually how I met my husband. And I know that's how a lot of people tend to meet today. There's also been a rise in people living on their own and having more freedom and independence in how they meet their partner and who they choose. As more people are living alone, this can lead to shifts in expectations of the relationship, like increased sexual activity during dating relationships, a rise of cohabitation, and in some cases, living apart relationships, which is when two people who consider themselves a couple live in separate households. And that's pretty common, especially for older people who have kind of their own established life, but they still have an intimate partner that they uh, have for the long term. Some living apart relationships are a result of a couple enjoying their independence and wanting their own space, but other instances are due to financial or practical reasons, like maybe one partner's job takes them out of state, so they live um, out of state most of the time, but then maybe on the weekends or something like that, they come home. As union formations change, there can be more ambiguity about who is in the relationship or what type of relationship they have, and then who is considered family. Okay. So we've talked about cohabitation throughout this semester, but cohabitation is defined as two unmarried adults in a romantic relationship who share a household together. Before the 1960s, cohabitation was common or was uncommon, or it was common among specifically the poor or near poor as a way to pool resources. But it was uncommon for middle class and upper class couples. For those poor or near poor couples who cohabitated more routinely, Those couples rarely married, but it was often considered a substitution for marriage, this cohabitating relationship. After the 1970s, couples began to live together more and more, regardless of income status, so it wasn't just limited to the poor or near poor. As cohabitation began to rise, there was also a rise in non-marital births. Cohabitation and reasons for cohabitation tend to vary based off on social class. So among college-educated cohabitating couples, cohabitation is considered a first step to marriage or a way to see if the relationship will work in the long term. These couples typically intend to get married soon or are already engaged. Among the moderately educated, most couples plan to cohabitate as a substitute for marriage. Although many couples express a desire to marry or want to marry, they don't think it's an affordable option, but instead choose to enter into long-term cohabitating relationships where they live as if they were married. These couples also tend to move in quickly and tend to have children together shortly after they've moved in together, or they move in because they are going to have a child together soon. Among low income or the least educated cohabitating couples, most couples do not consider getting married and will often have what's called serial cohabitating relationships, which is when couples move in together quickly, and if they break up, they find another partner with which they will cohabitate with. Oftentimes, these couples live together just as a way to pool resources. Okay. Now that we've talked about cohabitation, we'll move on to marriage. So marriage is no longer considered a universal experience for adults. Today, only about 75% of young adults say that they would ever marry, which is the lowest percentage on record in recent years. Our ideas about marriage and what a marriage is may vary, and it might have led to the shift in why so many people are not wanting to marry. So before the 20th century, marriage was an institution rather than an ideal. So institutional marriages emphasize male authority, duty, and conformity to social norms. So spouses were expected to work together under the husband's authority in institutions like churches and communities, and the law dictated what was expected from each spouse. However, this idea of marriage being two people working as a team for the greater good began to shift as people began to expect their marriages to be more personally fulfilling. In the early 1920s, there was a shift towards having a more I always struggle with my S's. Sexually fulfilling marriage. And then another shift towards, and that led to another shift towards more companionate marriages, which occurred in the 1940s. And companionate marriages emphasized affection, friendship, and sexual gratification. This led to shifts in power dynamics as men and women began to have more equal authority in the home rather than just the man or the husband calling all the shots in the relationship. However, the main relationship dynamic that typically applies to this specific type of marriage is the breadwinner homemaker dynamic, which, as we know, women typically stayed at home and men went out to work. So although the work was kind of divided evenly with one partner having a very specific role of being the homemaker and the other having a breadwinner, it still allowed men to have more power because they had more financial power. So over the years, companionate marriages have shifted towards what's called individualistic marriages, which are marriages that emphasize self-development, flexible roles, and open communication. This type of marriage is prevalent due to shifts in the economy as women enter the workforce and the standard of living increases for a lot of families. In these marriages, couples typically share similar roles and focus on who they are and how fulfilling their various roles are to them, which has also led to an increase in divorce because if people find that their marriages aren't emotionally fulfilling, they're more likely to get divorced. But moving on. Now we'll talk about the current context of marriage. So marriage in the US has changed in two major ways. People have more choice in their personal lives and more alternatives other than marriage are more socially acceptable than before, which has led to the deinstitutionalization of marriage. Because marriage is deinstitutionalized, it has lost a lot of its practical importance to couples and to the average person. but its symbolic importance has increased over time. So today, marriage is a mark of prestige or considered a goal that you work towards. Typically, marriage occurs after someone has completed school or has a stable income. So marriage is now considered a marker of true adulthood. Even weddings are considered markers of success. Today, people spend um, thousands of dollars on their weddings, and those are also considered a mark of personal achievement. I remember when I was planning my wedding, I would talk to my mom and my grandma, and they were just flabbergasted by how much we were budgeting for the wedding. When I talked to my grandma about it, she said that they went to, when she got married, her and my grandpa, they just went to a church, um, did their ceremony there, and then everyone came to their house afterward and they just like shared cake. It wasn't like a big production. And then my mom, when she had her wedding, she had it in the afternoon. She had it at church. And then afterwards, they like rented a space so that they could have like appetizers with everyone. And then for my wedding, it was the big whole production. It wasn't as crazy as it could have been, which I had to keep reminding my mom and grandma about because they didn't understand a lot of my choices. But today the expectation is like you throw a big party and you host a dinner basically. Um, and that takes a lot of money. And a lot of people do want the big wedding, which is oftentimes why a lot of low income or working class couples will postpone marriages because they really want that big wedding to celebrate their marriage and their relationship. Um, and a lot of research has found that that will support that. Yeah, low income unmarried couples will often postpone marriage until they have a big ready wedding rather than just going to a courthouse because it is considered a marker of, okay, now you're successful and now you're like worthy or like able enough to get married. Um, which isn't necessarily true, but that's kind of like the social and cultural thinking behind it. Although the practical reasons for marriage are no longer as prevalent, there are still some practical reasons for why people get married today. So, for example, most couples today split finances or make major financial decisions together. Some couples will raise children together, which is obviously a major investment that couples take on. Marriage can also keep a couple accountable and have them stay together for the sake of their investment, which is kind of closer to the concept known as enforceable trust. So read up on that for your test because it's going to come up. Okay. So as a wrap up, people today are more likely to have sex before marriage and cohabitate with their partner before marriage. It's more socially acceptable to do that because of the deinstitutionalization of marriage and because marriage is more of a symbolic thing rather than a practical thing. The marital bargain has changed now that couples pool their resources. So men have less power in the financial realm, and women are now equal earners in the relationship. So the market has changed, and women can be a little bit more picky about who they want to be with. People will often postpone marriage because marriage is considered a marker of prestige and distinction, which again leads us to that more symbolic understanding of what marriage is rather than this more practical institution. And there's a movement towards gender egalitarian marriages, which we talked about, or we will talk about in Work and Family when we talk about egalitarian marriages. But most of the time, couples are splitting up the divide of work. And it's more of how can we work together as a team now. So yeah, that's kind of our discussion on marriages and cohabitation. So yeah, now move on to Work and Families because we're definitely going to be talking about egalitarian marriages next.